The mix of music that became jazz began when African slaves were taken to the Caribbean and brought into contact with European religions and culture. Although the polite sound of Western sacred music bore no resemblance to their own, they found only subtle differences in the rites, and an amalgam began to form. Cross-cultural assimilation thrived in New Orleans, the gateway to America for slave trade from the Caribbean. On Sunday afternoon, slaves were permitted to congregate in the city's square to vent their frustrations and pain and celebrate a few hours of leisure through a remarkably passionate ritual of music and dance such as this continent had never before witnessed. Here in Congo Square, as it became known, were planted the seeds of jazz. An eyewitness described it. There was entertaining variety, constant, exhilarating novelty, endless invention in the turning, bowing, arm-swinging, posturing, and leaping of the dancers. Drummers bestrode the drums, and other musicians sat around them in an arc, cross-legged on the ground. One important instrument was a gourd, partly filled with pebbles or grains of corn. Other performers rang triangles, and others twanged from their Jew's harps, an astonishing amount of sound. Another instrument was the jawbone of some ox, horse, or mule, and a key rattled rhythmically along its weather-beaten teeth. But the grand instrument was the banjo. By the 1830s, this Sunday afternoon happening had become a popular attraction. On one occasion, a transplanted European couple brought their young son, Louis Moreau Gottschalk. He never forgot what he heard. In the following decade, having studied piano and composition in Paris, and become America's first international concert hall favorite, Gottschalk thrilled audiences with sounds that echoed what he had heard in Congo Square. One 1851 composition, the banjo, hinted at things to come a half-century later. An instrument of African origin, the banjo, loud and easily transported, became the choice of roaming minstrels whose ragged, syncopated style laid the foundation for that West African European mix we call jazz. But first, it led to ragtime. Gottschalk's reflections of what he heard in Congo Square profoundly affected Scott Joplin, a young African-American composer some 50 years later. Ragtime was an extension of Gottschalk's music, and Joplin was its undisputed master. Ragtime flourished in the Midwest and spread to the rest of the country, including New Orleans, where it had considerable influence on the musicians who shaped jazz. The seeds planted in Congo Square had germinated in Missouri and returned to New Orleans ready to flower. Clearly, no single person originated jazz, but at the turn of the century, when it began to take its first recognizable form, one man stood out, cornetist Buddy Bolden. He became the first jazz great, the music's first authentic legend. We know how he looked only from a blurry 1895 photograph, and long since extinguished are the fading memories that told us how he sounded. King Buddy Bolden was the first, recalled cornetist Bunk Johnson. His band had the whole of New Orleans real crazy and running wild behind it. I've never heard anything like that before in my life, said pianist Clarence Williams. Bolden was the first in a succession of New Orleans trumpet kings that included Freddie Keppert, Joe Oliver, and Louis Armstrong, who would become the personification of jazz.